Hello, everyone. This is the SCP podcast and your host, Dr. J. And today I have with me Dr. Bill Berman. Bill, how are you doing?
I'm doing just great. How are you? Thanks for having me on your show.
What did I say? Yes, we have got to get Bill on here. And so we're going to continue our series and just covering some of the basics and foundations of the field of consulting psychology. But before we hop into that, I'm going to let Bill introduce himself, but I do want to let everyone know I met Bill through the Society of Consulting Psychology, and I've gotten to know him over the years, especially as president last year, right?
Yep.
For SCP.
2 years ago. Yep.
2 years ago, that's what it was. Yep, Mark was president last year, and being able to work with you as far as the conference goes. So it's been a really cool experience. And so anyway, let's jump right into it. Bill, I would love for you to just introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about who you are, what you have going on.
So my name is Bill Berman. I'm the CEO of Berman Leadership Development. We're a bespoke executive development firm based in New York City. And we do assessments, coaching, team development, and onboarding for senior leaders and their teams. We've been doing this for 15 years. I have actually been a consulting psychologist since about 1993, when I started a consulting firm that was designed to evaluate healthcare outcomes for mental health delivery systems. I had no idea that I was a consulting psychologist. I didn't even know that there was such a thing as a consulting psychologist. But I started a business, I grew it, turned into a software company, and I sold that. And I've been a consulting psychologist in some form or another ever since. I've been a member of SCP for about 10 years or so, and it's a great organization. There are a lot of like-minded people. When I got here, I really felt like I was in my home with like-minded folks. So it's SCP is a great organization, and I'm absolutely thrilled to support it in any way I can.
Yes, thank you for that. I think we will all say, those of us who are here and a part of the organization, SCP is definitely like family compared to many other divisions. I believe it allows you for that intimate connection. So, which is why we're here today.
Absolutely.
You said something that I just want to touch on. You said, at the time you didn't know that you were doing consulting psychology. When do you think, when was that moment in your life, in your career, that you came into knowing that, wow, this is actually consulting that I'm doing? How did you know that?
So I was working for a consulting firm when I started back in 2004, when I left the software company I was working for. And I started doing some work for a consulting firm. And I still didn't know there was a thing called a consulting psychologist, but I knew that we were all psychologists doing consulting to corporations. So by default, I was a consulting psychologist. I found out that SCP existed a few years later. I had been going to PsyOp, and because I wasn't an IO psychologist by training, and I didn't know other IO psychologists other than the firm I was working with, it wasn't that gratifying an experience. And because my background is as a clinician, that's how I was initially trained. I didn't feel as at home with that group, even though I had a lot of the skills and capabilities that IO psychologists have. But nevertheless, when I got introduced to Society of Consulting Psychology, I very quickly, people here took me under their wing. They supported me. They introduced me to other people. Bob Lee was a critical part of that. Randy White was a critical part of that. Becky Turner was a critical part of that, and a whole bunch of other folks. And they made me feel welcome and really engaged.
Thank you for sharing that. And I
love that was 10 years ago, probably.
Oh, okay. So even, you said you went to PsyOp as a consulting psychologist because at the time, it sounds like maybe that was the only one that made it sound like it might fit being a psychologist. How did you, well, let me rephrase the question. based on what they were doing over at PsyOp or just as an IO psychologist, how does that differ from what you do as a consulting psychologist? Because I feel we get that question a lot, you know, like what's the difference between the two fields? How would you draw some sort of distinction?
So they're really overlapping Venn diagrams because you have IO psychologists that are consultants. You have clinical and counseling and social and school psychologists who do consulting. To me, consulting psychology is a broad field that a part of it is industrial organizational psychology, but it's really any type of psychology where you are using psychological knowledge in a organizational context. So if I'm a school psychologist and I have a colleague who's a school psychologist, she does a lot of consulting to organizations on mainstreaming. And so she works with a lot of school systems on how to deal with kids who have disabilities and how to bring them back into the classroom. That's consulting psychology. I have colleagues who are experts in diversity and inclusion who work with organizations on how to, anywhere from how to address microaggressions or unconscious bias to how to deal with setting policies and training programs to increase diversity. And they're consulting psychologists. They may not be a member right now of SCP, but they're still consulting psychologists. So we do, just like I had no idea as a clinical psychologist that there was a thing called consulting psychology. There are a lot of people out there in counseling, in school, in social and personality who do consulting work, but don't really think of themselves or don't really understand what's available to them in SCP and consulting psychology in general.
That's very helpful. And I think just me as an IO psychologist myself, I find myself more attracted to SCP or just the consulting psychology field because of the approach that is taken from that. And so what I hear you saying is, you know, whether you're an educational psychologist, a clinical psychologist, you're going into an organization and you're sort of taking a 30,000-foot view at that organization and then saying, you know, where they can optimize some of those areas that they may need help. Would I have that right?
That's exactly right. I was thinking about this. My first job out of graduate school was in a staff model HMO. And part of the message that our team gave to the primary care docs was that we are your consultant. We don't necessarily need to see every person that you think has a mental health issue, but we can consult to you and help you figure out what to do in those cases and decide whether we need to get personally involved or whether we can just consult. So essentially, I've been a consultant my whole career.
I love it. And I think even our listeners, those who are listening in today, I'm sure they're probably, you know what, maybe I'm a consultant as well. And they didn't even know it.
I think that's right.
So going back into this idea of the organization. So consulting seems to look at three different areas of the organization, whether it's the team, the individuals, or the organization. Can you just kind of unpack that a little bit and just tell us how you, as a consulting psychologist, would approach maybe those three levels within the organization? So
in my practice, we work with senior leaders and their teams. So sometimes we do leadership assessment, evaluate strengths and weaknesses, capabilities, areas for development. And that's done primarily with an individual and their manager or their HR representative. At other times, we'll work with a leader and their team. So we intervene not just at the individual level, but we'll work with the team. And that's typically a combination of individual coaching for the executive and working with the team to build cohesiveness, to improve communication, to improve alignment, to clarify strategic focus, to basically build teamwork. You know, in the real world, teamwork for the most part happens when you do things together. You have an experience, you work together, you work on a single problem, and you begin to trust each other because you see what the other one does and you see how you work together. A lot of times these days, particularly in business, particularly with COVID, you're not in person with the other person. You may not be working on the same project. The work may feel more like I pass work to you, you pass work to me. So it doesn't feel quite as much like a team. But intervening at the team level really helps a team work together and become more efficient and more effective. At an organizational level, you can do work that looks at organizational effectiveness, how much the organization engages their employees and builds an alignment with their employees. You can do things that do organizational assessments that look at culture or style or even strategic capabilities, and how you can look at those strategic capabilities and how you can improve those or leverage those. So you can intervene with individuals, you can intervene with teams, and you can intervene with the organization as a whole. Most of us tend to work at more senior levels in the organization because that has more impact. And what you'll sometimes see is that IO psychologists are much more involved in things like selection, competency models, job analyses. So things that require a high level of detail and typically require a large population of people.
Right.
So, you'll see the group I worked with would work with some of the largest companies in the world, looking at different types of jobs and how to structure those jobs and how to make sure that people understand how to do those jobs and are able to do them. So that's one of the differences between consulting psychologists and IO psychologists. Another is that PSYOP, for example, although it certainly has its practitioners, it has a large academic component, a large educational component. SCP is more about ongoing education or continuing education rather than graduate or specific postgraduate education.
Right. Okay, well, thank you for that, and especially diving in. And as I'm hearing you even kind of unpack this, looking at the organizations, looking at the teams, and then the individuals, it sounds very similar to how you might approach a clinical client. I'm assuming, you're diagnosing, and then you're providing, some sort of intervention. But of course, it's not clinical. But it just sounds like even there's some overlap with clinical. Do I have that?
A lot of clinicians work only with individuals. When I was trained, I was trained to work with families and groups. So for me, it was very generalizable because family systems are one type of system. Organizational systems have structural similarities to family systems, or family systems have structural similarities to organizational systems. There obviously are important differences, but they both work in a system, and you have to think about in a system, where's the best place to intervene? A lot of clinical psychologists only think about how to intervene with the individual.
Okay. So there's even another distinction there. Well, Bill, as we come up on time, I would love to what piece of advice would you leave with our audience? Those who are maybe early career or transitioning into this field, what advice would you have about them to start diving into the field of consulting psychology?
What I would tell you is don't feel like you have to do this all on your own. It's very hard, just as it's very hard as a clinician or a counseling psychologist to hang out a shingle and somehow hope that you get referrals. It's very hard to do it that way as well as a consulting psychologist. And so what I would suggest is that you work with colleagues, you subcontract with colleagues, you even get employed by organizations. There are a lot of consulting psych organizations. And you build up your experience and your relationships that way. And so that when you if you want to be an independent practitioner, you already have a network of people that you can tap into. So don't feel like, I have to just go out and do it by myself. Use your SCP community.
Absolutely love that. And I will tell everyone who is listening right now, This is the same advice Bill gave me years ago. I have used that advice and it has worked to my advantage. So I encourage you all, don't let this fall on deaf ears. Actually do something with it. But we will be having more conversations like this as we interview more of our SCP members, many of them senior, who just have experience and want to just share their knowledge with us. So we hope that you continue to tune in. And Dr. Bill Berman, thank you so much for joining me today.
Dr. J, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you. We are out.